From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello again. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis. And as camera 2 clicks over to our guest today, you'll see that it's Jean-Claude Brizard, who needs no introduction, especially if you watch this show regularly, because Mr. Brizard, we talk about you a lot behind your back. We've spoken of you many times in the last 8 months. So it's a real privilege to have you on the program here today. And I imagine that if there are 2 or 3 people in Chicago who are busier than you on a given day, I don't know who they are. So for you to spend half an hour here with us is something that it means a lot to me, and I'm glad you're here. In thinking about our conversation today and being jealous of the 29 minutes or so that we have, a couple of thoughts occurred to me. First of all, I think it's important for me to say to you right at the beginning that I am a lifelong Chicagoan. We've never met before. I'm a product of the Chicago Public Schools, which I hope we can talk about a little bit later on. But because of that, and because of the historic issues with the Chicago Public School systems and what it means to the future of Chicago, I have nothing but good wishes for you. All right? So there goes my journalistic, thing out the window. I want you to succeed, and I believe almost all Chicagoans want you to succeed, because this is just a desperate time, and we need everybody sort of pulling together as much as is possible. So I don't know, I just kind of wanted to say that right up front, because as we get into challenging issues, it's going to sound maybe like I'm in opposition to you or something. It's not true. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that I've seen you in a number of situations where you're in community meetings and that kind of thing, and everybody is assaulting you about what's going on with the temperature of the pizza in the lunchroom, whatever it is, right? And today I want to try to keep this thing as big as possible. I want to try to continue to focus on who is J.C. Brizard. You've been with us for 8 or 9 months now. Yes. You have a kind of an intimate relationship with us, because what you do and what you determine affects kids sitting in their bedroom doing homework, conversation around the kitchen table. It's like you are, in many ways, you're more a part of the family than the mayor or anybody else.
Mm-hmm. People care about what happens with their kids. I have 2 young children.
I know.
And I can tell you, in fact, today my wife is out looking at schools. That kind of information, that kind of experience, I know is really important. Everyone thinks their child is the most important person in the world, and they should. Mm-hmm. So responding to that varied need across the city is a challenge, but one we have to meet.
She's actually out, like, auditioning schools?
Oh, she's visiting. She's walking around schools, talking to the principals, talking to teachers. My wife is an educator. She's a teacher. She knows what she's looking for. That will determine.
You understand how explosive this is? I mean, yeah. You really want to be talking about that happening?
But I really want to talk about the fact that it's important. As a parent, I know where parents come from. I know where they're coming from, what they're looking for. I know what I want for my son and for my daughter. Mm-hmm. And every parent wants the same for their children. Mm-hmm. So if that's so important for me, if that is the data point for where I'm going to live ultimately, permanently in the city, I know every parent is looking for a good neighborhood school to put their children in. They don't want to count on the lottery, although many are doing that. They don't want to count on the test. They want to make sure they have a guarantee of a good education for their children.
Let me just throw all my notes out here and jump to the middle of the conversation that I had sort of carefully planned here, because this is, you just got me right into the thing that I most want to talk about with you today. We have all of this conversation about charter schools and selective enrollment schools, and to almost sort of paraphrase the Republican leader for the nomination, I don't even care as much about the really well-heeled kids who have advocates and all that. Mm-hmm. I am much more concerned about what happens in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I perceive that you might be too, and that's kind of what I wanted to get at with you. As I said, I went to Chicago Public Schools my whole time. I graduated from Prosser when it was a vocational high school, mm-hmm. and I went for 8 years to Stowe Elementary out in Humboldt Park. And my experiences were not great. These were not great schools. They were not schools that excelled. They had teachers who were phoning it in most of the time, but there were exceptional teachers who helped really kind of keep me focused and got me through some tough times. But the schools were, I mean, Stowe was, you know, in Humboldt Park in the 50s, it was like all the windows were broken. It was a horrible place. Later on, I actually became a principal for a day for a couple of years, went back and was amazed at how much better it was. But I bring that up not to complain about my own education, but just to say that this is not new. What we're dealing with here is not new. For 50 years.
It's been around a long time. In fact, schools are better now than they were 50 years ago, but the perception is that they're worse today than they were 50 years ago. The dropout rate was actually higher back in the 50s. The difference was that there was an industry for a lot of the kids that we lost.
Absolutely.
To capture them, the world's changed. So, you know, we say very simply that back in the 70s or 80s, for that matter, if only half the kids got it, we moved on, and it sort of was okay. You know, we didn't worry about the ones who didn't get it. We said, well, they were too poor, or the parents didn't care, or they didn't like a particular subject. We are now in a world where every single kid has to make it. For us to remain competitive as a city, as a country, we've got to find a way for every child to make it. So the structures that we created back in the early 1900s don't work anymore for today's society. So we've got to change the whole paradigm.
My parents and perhaps yours worked as, you know, they were factory workers all their lives. And at least that was one thing. There was never a shortage of factory jobs. If you wanted to be an assembler or something, you could always find a job. Your predecessor, or the interim predecessor, was Terry Mazzani. He spoke shortly before he left office. He was at the Union League Club Chicago, and he made some just incredible comparisons to things which I have to dig through to find here. He said that India and China in the next few years will become 50% of the world's gross domestic product, that China puts 9.5% of its GDP into education. The United States spends 17% of, I'm sorry, the Chinese spend 17% of GDP on education. We spend 5%. And you can go on and on and on. Our American schools are, well, Illinois schools are meeting or exceeding state standards 17% of the time, he says. And those, only the ones who are exceeding state standards are the ones who even have a chance of getting into a decent college.
Exactly. I mean, the way we measure excellence in Illinois, we all know is inadequate. We look at the definition of proficiency, meets and exceeds, and we know the meets really is not where the schools need to be. Exceeds is really the new definition of meeting. Going back to China, I think it's one where our country is beginning to realize what's happening. We thought that the Chinese were going to be great sort of recipients of our technologies and our products. We're finding out we're buying from them versus them buying from us. So the table's been turned, and if we're not very careful as a country, we already are behind the pack, well behind the pack. If we don't change things around education, fundamentally change education, we are in real trouble as a nation. We used to be #1 in college graduation. We're now number 13 and falling behind very, very quickly. Something has to give. The model we created simply is obsolete. We've got to find a better way to educate our people.
So then the obvious question is, how in the name of the good Lord can Chicago ever hope to compete? What gives you optimism that our city can compete with what's going on in the world, in Germany, Japan, any number of other places?
Well, I'm going to start first of all by saying that we stand on the shoulders of giants. When you look at the work that Paul Vallas did in Chicago, Arnie Duncan, Ron Huberman, we are learning a lot about what they did well, some of the fault lines around implementation. One of the greatest things that happened to this state and to this country most recently is the creation of the new Common Core state standards. For the first time, we have real sort of demarcation lines or standards in math and science, hopefully soon to have in social studies and the other subject areas that define what world standard is. I had a gentleman here yesterday from England talking about benchmarking globally, and he says what we have to get to is that if you graduate from high school in Chicago, and we tell you good math, is that good enough for Korea, for Finland, for Singapore, for Great Britain? Those standards will get us there. So defining quality and the standards is what we are doing. That's a major first step in addressing the issue. Then, of course, making sure the teaching follows, the assessments follows, the interventions follow. We have great hope and optimism that we're going to be successful in making this work if we execute well.
But you know that prior to your coming here, the University of Chicago issued a study which it would take 2 hours to go through it. But I think you could summarize it by saying that after 20 years of reform, and there's been a lot of it in Chicago, the reading and the math scores are at best described as flat. Kids who graduate are still graduating at an average of a 17 ACT. You and I both know that 21, 22, 23 is the minimum you need, and you maybe need 30 if you want to get really to get somewhere. So you're talking to an old guy who, as I said, was I was at Stowe 50 years ago, and we have spent the last 20, 25 years doing one level of reform after another. You mentioned, Duncan and all the rest of them. Duncan went on to become, Secretary of Education. But after all of this reform, the best thing we can say is that Chicago at some point stopped declining.
Yes.
I mean, I guess that's a big accomplishment. But, you didn't know Mayor Daley the way we all did. We had 20 years of Mayor Daley, and I think it would be safe to say that Mayor Daley made it his absolute top priority. He wanted schools improved. He did everything that he could think of, threw everything against this problem. And again, the best we can say is that they didn't go down much.
Yeah, but
so I realize the inane nature of this question, but how does a guy like you walk into this with some optimism that you're going to be able to make this better? I don't understand.
Reports like that, I think, have been phenomenal for us in unpacking what's happened over 20 years. And one thing that we are doing right as we speak is sort of taking a look at where we did not execute well. I actually had my staff read one of the Harvard case studies on Arnie Duncan and his years. It was 2006. And one of them came back and said, I'm depressed. And I said, why? He said, what is being talked about in this case study is what we're talking about doing. I said, exactly. So the work is not, the headlines are not different around teacher quality, principal quality, school quality. The question is, how do we make sure that we are systemic and that we execute really well? So it's 10% inspiration, it's 90% execution. When you take a look at what's happened over the 3 eras of school reform, which is what the report talks about, you can begin to see the disconnected nature of the reform efforts in Chicago. For instance, if you talk about creating great teachers, but if you don't talk about making sure you have an amazing leader who understands how to create a constellation of great teachers around him or her to be successful, a great principal, a constellation of great teachers. The second piece, which is what's been missing in Chicago for a while, is common standards, common curriculum across the city. We have had a mishmash of literacy initiatives that don't always answer the question.
Initiative piles.
Oh, absolutely.
We have piles of initiatives on top
of
initiatives.
So we have a litany. I mean, we've had 1,000 different initiatives, but no coherent strategy. So good stuff, but not connected well, which is exactly what things like that help us do.
Forgive me for this, but we have the issue of what is real and what is perceived, okay? There is a perception that I'd like to have you deal with. I'd like to have you to hear how you would respond to what I think is a widely held public perception, that you and Mayor Emanuel essentially just believe that the only way you're going to be able to fix this place is to commercialize it. Just turn the schools over to commercial entities, to not-for-profits like AUSL. Just bring in other people because we have tried and not been able to fix this. So let's bring in some outsiders and just kind of basically sell the schools off to commercial entities.
I'm not sure where the perception comes from. I think it's one that's right now national. A lot of people are talking about charter schools being private, etc. Charter schools are public schools. What I argue very simply is that we have to really get to a point where we don't worry about governance structure. We talk about who's operating, but making sure we have great schools operating. So I'm one who really believes in standards and accountability. If you create a great frame of accountability, let us create a system of schools, not a school system. So if AUSL can create great schools, by all means, let them do it. If you can get a good charter, by all means, let them do it. That does not mean, though, that you don't invest, that you do not work with neighborhood schools and selective enrollments. You want to create what we call a portfolio system of schools that address the needs of different community. And that the antagonist always going to push that we're privatizing. But it really is about finding great operators who know how to create great schools within a city to serve the needs of children across the city.
I'm not a professional education reporter. I'm just a citizen who's got a cable TV show. So I profess no great knowledge of this. But certainly it has been written in many places that when you look over some time at the AUSL schools or you look at charter schools, not only in Chicago, I think this is kind of a national thing, as you say, but they over time don't really perform any better than the schools they replaced. Some of them are excellent, some of them are not excellent,
yes.
Some of them are terrible. So this is not a magic bullet. This portfolio that you're talking about is filled with people who are still trying the same things. And one thing I know there's a story out today. In fact, we have some news because the U of C did a report on the turnaround schools. I mean, well, maybe you should explain what it is.
Well, it's 20 years of turnarounds, including charter schools, so restarts. What's a bit difficult with the report is that it looks at 20 years of reform around school closures. So it's a mishmash of different strategies, interventions.
Everything from turning around to closing to.
But what it does show is that after year one, the improvements are remarkable. Not every school succeeds. So it goes back to your comment around the charter school. When you have a great vetting process for creating charter schools, the output, the outcome tends to be quite good. If you don't have a good vetting process where you allow any old individual or any group to open a charter school, you're going to get mixed results. If you look at the charter world across the country, the results have been mixed because some cities and some states have low standards around the vetting of who actually opens a charter. It goes back to what we know works in a good school. It's leadership, it's good teaching, good curriculum.
Which then leads me, and I apologize if I'm cutting you off, but it leads me to this kind of question in my head of like when AUSL comes in and takes over a school, I don't know, there's some numbers here. Let's see, according to the Chicago News Cooperative, I hope this is correct, AUSL schools receive $1.5 million more than their neighborhood counterparts during the first 5 years, $420 per pupil, $2.4 million more. Let's not dwell on the numbers. More resources are put in. There are plenty of people who would say, well then, if you went to a school that kind of has a good teacher but has been underperforming for a really long time, and perhaps that school has been underperforming, by the way, because it's become, forgive the use of the term, but a kind of a dumping ground for less performing students, and you go in and paint the place, put in some new lights, clean it up, and bring in a couple of $1 million of some new money, maybe that school will come up 3 or 4 months in its performance, just like an AUSL school would. What's the difference?
What the report does not say is that we pour a lot of resources into other schools over many, many years, and they still fail. So what you see here is not just about the additional per pupil dollars. It really is a combination of effort, a recipe that we see is actually working. It highly trained turnaround principals, highly trained turnaround teachers at National St. Louis who come together around a no excuses attitude and culture. They sweat the small stuff. They look at paint. They look at if a child's hair is not combed, they comb it. I mean, they really sweat the tiny stuff. They will place a new teacher sandwiched between 2 veteran teachers so they can share best practices. If you take a look at what happens at an USL school, it's not one thing. It's a multitude of strategies that come together as a recipe to produce a really wonderful meal. And on the contrary, if you go to another school that's failing, You can pour resources. It's like pouring money down a bottomless pit. Unless you change a lot of other things, you're not going to get the success you're looking for.
But it is a lot of other things you have to change. And
Absolutely.
You know what? I want to, again, I'm just radically jumping around here.
That's fine.
You're probably aware of the fact that Juan Williams, the conservative pundit, has released a kind of a half-hour quote-unquote documentary. I think it would be fair to say that it is a broadside against the Chicago Teachers Union. I mean, it's, you know, that's what it is. That's what he does. A bit shocking to me is that your boss, Mayor Emanuel, appears in it 4 times. And I just want to play a clip for you so you can see. This is what Mayor Emanuel said, and I just want to get your reaction to this. This is from the recently released documentary.
The top 10 high schools, I think it's 6 or 5 are Noble. Take out the self-selective enrollment ones.
Right.
Top 10.
Noble.
Noble. They have the secret sauce down. They got the combination to the lock. I talk to my colleagues around the country, mayors. They're trying to figure out how to turn high schools around, etc. We have it right here. You can go into a Noble high school, put a blindfold on before you walk in. Nobody tells you, and I can tell you whether you're just at any school or you're at a Noble charter school. And I went to speak in the lunchroom where they were at breakfast, about 200 of them, kids. The principal holds up the hand, the room becomes quiet. Do I think the union leadership has been a problem in resisting? Absolutely. They're suing me in the courtroom. So they can say what they want. My view is, let's not spend time in the courtroom, let's spend time in the classroom. Help me design how the math should be done, the reading, the writing. Focus on the classroom. Leave the courtroom to other people. It's not where we belong. Noble has the most successful high schools I've seen. There is a mission to their work that we have to return to every school. They have involved parents, committed teachers, a principal that is trained and ready to go and not scared about being held accountable and measures the results. They're on a mission. They're not just doing a job. They're on a mission.
Now, those are excerpts taken, but we wanted to run them in their entirety. I know it took a little time, but Mayor Emanuel just said that the most effective high schools he's seen are the ones run by Noble, but his Chicago public school system has Whitney Young, it has Northside Prep, it has Lane, it's got a lot of other schools that perform
Really
way
well.
better than any Noble school does. So why are we doing that? Why is Mayor Emanuel going on this national thing and essentially saying that he thinks the teachers union is part of the problem and that a lot of his schools aren't as good as they are? I don't understand it.
Well, let me just say that Noble Street has a collection of some of the best high schools I've ever seen in my career. And I've been a high school guy for over 20 years. We have great high schools like Whitney Young and Lane Tech, etc. Some of these schools are selective in nature, which one can argue, create some of the success. Although great teaching, great leadership in those schools. We also have schools like Kenwood Academy and others in the city who are terrific schools. So we have good high schools, not enough of a quantity for parents to be happy, for us to be happy. But when you take a look at Noble Street, they have average kids coming in. In fact, UIC College Prep was the first non-selective high school to hit 21 on the ACT. So what they have is a recipe that really works. And I'll tell you, I've got my principals and school chiefs visiting. I've talked to colleagues across the country to come and see what is happening at Noble Street. Amazing set of schools, one we also need to emulate and replicate across the city. So I completely agree. In terms of the union, I think one thing I will always push is that teachers want their union to be strong, etc., and I completely support that. But the one thing we have to help unions do is evolve. I mean, the world's changed a bit. The rules that currently exist around teacher pay, etc., were put in place for good reasons. We had overzealous administrators back in the 60s, maybe 70s. When you take a look at who became teachers historically in our nation, I mean, there were women, African Americans, etc., who needed protection from overzealous administrators. Take a look at who's coming into the profession now. We have young people who have great option. They can become lawyers, doctors. The ceiling the glass ceiling is gone way up or disappeared in some cases for women and for minorities. So people who want to come into the profession are looking for something different. They want agency in their profession. They want to be paid according to their skill set, what they do, not just based on a lockstep, how long you've been there, how many college credits you have. So somehow, I've got to help my teachers union and others sort of evolve to really understand what the membership is asking for today, what today's young teacher demands of the system. I fear if we don't do that, we're going to discourage a lot of bright young people from entering the profession. Already I'm hearing it. I'm watching it in the research coming out of Harvard, who are saying that a lot of young teachers don't want to come into teaching because it's not perceived to be a noble profession. It is one of the best professions. I'm a teacher. It is the noblest of profession. Unless we get young people to come into this profession, I'm afraid it's losing its luster.
We are literally down to our last couple of minutes here, and we've just opened so many cans of worms, I don't even know where to go. But the teachers union would say, if they were sitting here, that one of the hugest problems we have is that, for good reasons, a lot of these selective enrollment places have opened, and charters, and many of them are excellent. But in the process, the system has, not intentionally, but the system has creamed over and over and over, and we're now in our third and fourth level of creaming. And we have situations like, I just have to mention, I was at the public hearing the other night for Diet High School, which of course is going to be scheduled to close. And their argument is, for 7 years, the existence of this school, it's had no resources. It's had nothing put into it. We have had the challenge of dealing with kids coming in with third grade level, blah blah blah. You know.
Oh, I hear it, absolutely.
So yeah, it's one thing to talk about, the teachers union needs to evolve, but it's also, they are the only ones who are out there sometimes saying that we've got to advocate for these kids who are. You want to talk about no child left behind? We have entire school districts left behind.
Yes. So I will argue they're not the only ones out there advocating.
Okay.
So
Right.
we are too.
Right.
And I completely agree with a lot of what is being said. It goes back to the strategy and being systemic. And selective enrollment schools are great schools, but when you do that, you have to take into account that you are creaming kids, and you are leaving more schools to be homogeneous, who have kids coming in not prepared for high school, which is why our strategy focuses on, again, goods of the past, errors of the past, and correcting some of those. If you hear my rhetoric, we talk about supporting neighborhood schools. We talk about, yes, creating selective enrollments, but not at the expense of neighborhood schools. And too much of that has been done in the past. And when
you're reaping the sad rewards of that well-intended policy.
Absolutely.
There's always unintended consequences from these things. Mr. Brizard, I'm so sorry we're out of time. I wanted to talk about so many things. We didn't even talk about the full school day program, and I apologize for that. Will you?
Absolutely.
Then okay, we'll do that. We'll come back and we'll talk about that and a bunch of other things another time. I really appreciate your time, and as I said, I sincerely wish you the best. Thank you so much for being with us today. Jean-Claude Brizard joining us. He is, of course, the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools, and it's been an honor to have him on the program. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom here. It's a community service of CAN TV. Of course, you can find this and all these other programs here on cable, but you can see this and other programs at cantv.org/newsroom. It's an archive of all of our shows. Really want to have you do that, and you can check us out there. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes as a podcast. I'm Ken Davis, thanking you for joining us, and we will see you next time right here on Chicago Newsroom. Thanks for watching.